W14 is coming pretty soon, and I have some info on how there are actually two ways Mercedes can go about this concept. Both ways will be really shown differently and could be developed differently. It depends on how Mercedes wants to pursue it, but the big talk of really the offseason we've had so far has been Hamilton's cockpit position and how he sits a little too close to those front wheels, and whether they want to actually keep the positioning of that or actually change it. Now that is dependent on which concept they take. And I have info and I can show you guys some images of how this might actually look. And we'll use comparisons of other cars and really the news we're getting around as to how fast this car can be. We do know that upgrades are coming in both Baku and Miami for the W14 to help improve upon really the cooling package and the suspension and how that will tie into the really W14 car. We recently just found out that the Red Bull car has an insane actual dip in its suspension, which makes it such an insanely fast car, something Mercedes has a complete opposite of. So will they changing it to the Red Bull side? Well, I'll tell you this, that's not going to happen, and I think them going down the Red Bull route will look a little bit different than we probably expect. And them having that huge undercut side pod with the really cut in the middle on the top of the side pod to have almost two flows going to the both bottom of the floor and to the back of the rear suspension, I don't think that's what we're going to get, because clearly McLaren has that and it isn't the same. The way their gearbox is set up in the back will actually determine on how this side pod concept will look and where that cockpit position will be. Before I get more into depth about it and the news around Mercedes we're really having up until another more week till Baku, please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world for me. If you're not, please do hit that notification bell. You guys mean the world, and thank you all so much for the support. Let's get back into the W14 video. As I was talking about, there are two concepts, and here, I'm gonna put up on the screen right now the Mercedes and Aston Martin side by side. The reason why I use this concept as a real comparison is because the actual Mercedes car and the Aston Martin car use the same engine and have to follow the same rear suspension and rear diffuser setup, because Aston obviously buys that. Now, the biggest thing that you can catch out of this is in an article about how the Mercedes, the biggest thing as to why the cockpit is so far forward is the actual side pod concept, but that little wing that they have above the side pod that makes the concept be like that, and why the actual balance of the car has to be more forward. Now, to actually kind of counteract them having a no side pod, but also trying to have the flow go through the car in a specific way, they have that little wing part right above the actual inner part to their side pod. And what this does is distribute the airflow in a specific way. Now, if you look at Aston Martin, who has a more conventional style, even though they do have that very waterfall slide type side pod, the difference is that their actual no side pod concept is very much backed up because the actual wing part about it needed to be higher. They could not bring that side pod concept any further, so then their floor also goes a little further back to actually now counteract that. They put the seat closer for balance purposes. This is why they lose a lot in their really rear part of the car. Last year's car, even the W13, had the cockpit further back. Now, it was not much of a difference, but it was a difference because the gearbox is also different and the way that they set up that back. And if we do know this, the W13 had probably, if not arguably, the best downforce for the 2022 season. Now, was that its really downfall? It was, because they weren't able to pull out that straight line speed because the car was extremely draggy. Now this year, they took a lot of drag off of the car, but they didn't add a lot of downforce. So clearly that concept is flawed, and that's why they're going for something different. And as I talked about, the Aston Martin car and their side pod is pushed up a little bit. Even the driver position in this seat, the W14 is a bit longer, so it is a little misleading. I think that the Aston Martin car is still a little higher up in its cockpit, but this picture still does a good comparison of the cars side by side. Alonso, in comparison to Lewis Hamilton in this picture specifically, it does look like Alonso is a lot further back. He's not in the actual way that the cockpits look. He's just a teensy bit more back. And that will play a very important part. Now, if you put up a side image, because this is the only image that I could find of them really being side by side, of Red Bull and Aston Martin, the Red Bull is even further back on the car. Now, the reason why Mercedes cannot do what the Red Bull does, but can do what their Aston Martin is, their actual gearbox setup, the way that the back of the car is set up and how much they have to actually allow for its engine, its gearbox and rear diffuser to have space to fit into the car. So they cannot go for that exact same Red Bull setup unless they want a car that will take a lot to be balanced. Like I talked about before, the front suspension and the rear suspension for the Red Bull is very particular to that car. It's also why we see drivers like Checo struggle, because that car is very oriented towards people like Max Verstappen, who really rely on the front brakes and just putting that car to a halt and being able to stop at like an insane pace. The Mercedes car, and the way that Lewis is always driven, now we don't know for George Russell's case because he always drove a Williams, but for Lewis's case, he loves a car to be perfectly balanced. So now the Mercedes did not follow the concept that he already talked about before, and now we essentially have like an idea that the cockpit was what he was talking about as to why is the car like this. We did not want the car like this, and I already mentioned over the winter to not have the car really have this type of cockpit. But now that they're stuck with this and their actual gearbox, they cannot change that part of the chassis. And the actual McLaren car, their side pods, looking at them side by side right now, is a lot further up. And I think this is what Mercedes is gonna do to try and counteract that cockpit being really feeling the different way that it does. I think they're gonna try and push it back just a slightest bit, because the actual McLaren car does sit back a teensy bit further. So they will push it back further. They're gonna bring up those side pods to not have that no side pod design anymore and switch up their floor completely. It's gonna look something like a McLaren, but a completely different philosophy on the floor, because McLaren's floor is what is flawed, and I will have a video of that actually this week. The floor for the Mercedes W14 right now is made specifically to actually pick up on its front downforce. Now that is something Mercedes will change to actually be able to pick up on that rear, have a way better rear, and make a way happier Lewis Hamilton. It will also make for a way more better balanced car. The car will have the design, and it will keep those big shoulders that it has, because that was essentially made to have its lateral downforce. The car will start to look a lot more different in these coming races, and the cooling package will even more further the design that I'm talking about, because the cooling will have to be a lot different. Obviously, this cooling is reliant on it going through that path with that little wing. Now that it's different, they can bring up probably their cooling kind of like how Aston Martin has it, and they will rely on really the engine getting cooled in a different way through different airflow. The front suspension is getting changed within the coming races, so this will further give us an idea of exactly how that flow will go. All we know right now is that the way that the no side pod concept works and the way that regular side pods work, it won't correlate to each other, and they will have to change and bring up that side pod design, which will give Lewis Hamilton essentially what he wanted in the beginning, which is a cockpit that is a little further back and will help with the balance big time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, subscribe, it would mean the world, and peace.